Update on um, developing my BNL circuit experiment, line of experiments, in conjunction with using it as a bionic device associated with my earthing bedsheet connected to an earthing grounding rod and a single wire connection between them and the circuit in the middle, in line. It's proving to be very useful. I'm learning that when two diodes are placed on either side of an electromagnet and pointing inwards towards the electromagnet, it creates this immunity from negativity, in which when I wake up the next day, I handle negativity much better, more resilient, more happy-go-lucky, more positive-oriented, and I kind of float above the pain that living in the world creates. And the kind of pain I'm referring to is the kind in which people are like well-mannered or well-intentioned for themselves, kind of selfishly, and all they're interested in is to see what they can get out of you, some kind of help or something, money or whatever. Yeah, some cases money in the form of theft. And how do you cope with that? Well, this automatically creates a mental state in which if I'm hurt, it doesn't last. A few seconds or minutes, a few minutes, and it rolls off. Like Charlie Luce used to say, you got to learn to roll with the punches. And I thought, how do you do that, Charlie? Well, this does it automatically. It does it from a physiological standpoint in cultivating a state in which it's possible to get over stuff very quickly and not let them linger, nor exacerbate into a full-blown anger attack, So I'm able then to mix with people and not hide from them, because it's just easier to have a cheery disposition and be helpful to them at the same time. It's all about exchange, right? Energy exchange, as we say. I do something for you, you do something for me, and then we are able to accomplish a lot more than if we didn't do that. In fact, that's a phrase from the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verse 11. Anyway, so the two diode placements and the fact that they point towards each other with the electromagnet in between, aligned in line with the two leads, one entering and one exiting the electromagnet, is a very interesting arrangement, those three parts. And I got it off of energetic forums. Somebody had posted the idea that radiant energy that Tesla was dealing with has to be processed. You don't just extract it from the background. You have, of whatever source you're getting it from. In my case, I'm getting it from the electric flow itself, not from the ambient background. I'm pretty much definitely sure that what we call electron holes, that entity within the NPN or a PNP transistor layered substrate, we have one layer is the electrons, collects electrons, and the other layer collects electron holes. I'm going to have to find out which is which. I forgot which is which. Well, it's the electron holes that flow in the opposite direction to the flow of electrons. So if electrons go towards the cathode and away from the anode, then the electron holes do the opposite. They flow away from the cathode towards the anode, and that's, if I have my nomenclature correct, that's the way the diode is marked. And so I point the anode side of the diode towards each other with the electromagnet in between, in line, in between. And that is an amazing situation. Now, if you point the diodes pointing outwards, they'll collect electrons into the, they'll accumulate and collect electrons in the vicinity, in the midst of the interior of the electromagnet, and that has the sensation of draining life force from out of my body. Not a pleasant feeling. But if I do it the other way and make it difficult for electrons to accumulate within the electromagnet, then they can be produced there. That's the way the ether works. The ether flows from a low to a high, oddly enough. It's the opposite to the airflow regarding air pressure, flowing from a high pressure zone to a low pressure zone within a weather pattern. So radiant energy ends up accumulating in the vacuum, in the space between molecules and between electrons, and it wants to flow in the opposite direction. It wants to get away from the crowd, so to speak. So the electron is crowding the circuit, creating pressure, voltage, and the radiant energy wants to go where the voltage is not, in the space where it does not exist. And if it's sent to an electromagnet, then it has the opportunity of being converted into electrons. So what's a trap, basically? It's you set the trap, you bait the trap, and you get more energy, more electrical energy out of the trap. So it's a funny anomaly. I used to think that somehow the either the electric keeper or the magnetic keeper, the two toroids of the BNL circuit, is where the extra energy is appearing. But that's not necessarily where it's coming from. It's coming from the Earth, but not in the form of amperage, but in the form of voltage. And in the grounding rod situation, it's not even originating as voltage, it's originating as magnetic influences impinging upon the two sets of grounding rods. But because they're iron, they respond to low frequencies. And because they're copper-clad steel rods, as Clarence has specified, the copper responds with the lens effect, namely the flow of current in the opposite direction. And of course, it's got low resistance, so we use it over something like aluminum. But silver is even more diamagnetic than is copper. So I have this wire I'm using that's silver-clad aluminum. Excuse me, it's copper-clad aluminum. But if I had had silver-clad copper, it would have been the same thing, only even better, less resistance. So diamagnetic material is what the copper represents in Tesla's trimetal generator. And diamagnetics creates the lens effect. And that's their purpose, is to create the lens effect. Water is diamagnetic, silver is diamagnetic, various substances. So Tesla chose copper because it's common and it's relatively cheap. Now aluminum responds to high frequencies and can serve as the core of an electromagnet, just like air does. Because, oh wait a minute, no, air is diamagnetic, isn't it? No, water is diamagnetic. Oxygen is paramagnetic, but there's very little oxygen in the air. I'm going to have to look up the magnetic property of nitrogen and oxygen. That would be interesting to find out if it's paramagnetic. Because normally high frequency core to an electromagnet is air-based. But apparently aluminum has an additional virtue to it that air does not have, or else Tesla would not have specified, according to William Line, in the video excerpt between him and Paul Scarzo, that Tesla was shifting towards high-frequency transformers with an aluminum core and getting away from iron. So William says he was reducing the weight of the transformer, but he implies he was also getting away from low frequencies because of saying that it's for high-frequency transformer situations. So here we have, and there's another thing. Iron has hysteresis. It has memory. It has magnetic memory. What's called hysteresis, I'm finally learned. And aluminum does not have hysteresis. So that's the difference between iron and aluminum. But you need it coupled with copper. That's an experiment I learned yesterday from somebody on the Donald Smith It's either the Donald Smith devices or too good to be true, or else the Donald Smith resonance energy devices. Two different threads on Donald Smith. One of them, I can't remember which, had this guy post his experiment in which he had an aluminum pipe that was very large. It was massive. It was like 2 feet 3 inches wide, and it had a very, of course it's going to be very heavy weight, very thick gauge pipe. And he had a wire, a copper insulated wire, go down the center as his pickup. And the pipe was a floater, a floating plate, and it was a high frequency device, and it helped boost the output. No, excuse me. He said it functioned as a equivalent substitute to a grounded aerial. That's what he said it did. And so he could remove the grounded aerial. Well, this is perfect. This is exactly what I've been looking for, is verification to my supposition that Barbosa and Leal does not have to be grounded. It can be picked up and removed from the earth. So maybe Tesla had a big aluminum pipe in his Pierce Arrow 1931 car demonstration. And he didn't need a plate, an aluminum plate on the back side. He didn't need to make use of the antenna. And apparently he may not even have had to make use of the chassis of the car itself, which would have been made out of iron. He just had a big aluminum pipe with a copper wire hung on the exterior in the center of that pipe, a very wide section of pipe. 2.5, over 2 feet diameter. That's a pretty wide section of pipe. He could have been laid on the underside, I suppose, if the car sat high off the ground. It could have been hidden underneath, out of view, so nobody would see it. It could have been under the hood, where the engine would have been, because electric motors don't take up much space. And that car is a luxury car. It's over 4,000 pounds, the 1931 Pierce Arrow. I think the model 43, I want to guess 42, 43, somewhere around in there, their model number. They just numbered them. They didn't give them fancy names like we do today. But the engine, the space for the engine up front is very long. So he could have put the pipe in there lengthwise. Length meaning front to aft. Port to starboard. Is that right? No. Front to starboard. Port to aft. Port to aft. Port ahead, starboard aft. Yeah, port to starboard. There we go. Port to starboard. Port ahead, starboard aft. I thought port ahead, starboard aft. Oh, forget it. Front to back. I don't know my sailing nomenclature. Whatever. Astern. Port ahead. Astern aft. There we go. So, where was I? So, I covered the diodes. I covered aluminum versus iron. So this is the reason why he came up with something that was made of trimetals. Now, why would it incorporate both iron and aluminum? Probably because he either has two different transformers in this thing, or two different sets of differing quantity of transformers, and they're meant to operate together. And if the grounding rods of Clarence's replication of Barbosa and Leal are meant to be another transformer of a type, it's quite possible because he used copper-clad steel grounding rods. So the copper-clad, the electroplated copper, serves as a substitute for copper winding surrounding an iron core transformer core, because he's got the copper clad over the steel rod, 8-foot grounding rod, 7-pounder each. 7 pounds times 60 rods, that comes out to about over 400 pounds. And Tesla said for every 200 pounds of iron, added, connected to the device, 1 horsepower was added to the output, so whatever, above and beyond whatever the output would be originally. So, roughly speaking, 2 horsepower was added to the output of those 400-pound grounding rods. But I looked up what horsepower amounts to. It amounts to half a kilowatt. And depending on the devices that Clarence said he could power, like a microwave or a space heater at one time, not all of them at one time, but just one at a time, well, that turns out to be surpassing 2 kilowatts. So at least that shows that the grounding rods may be adding to the output, and of course they do. And they add more than merely 1 kilowatt, because that would be 2 horsepower. Because the Earth is contributing a magnetic field impinging upon the rods. So the rods have an influence and impact on the output, but the magnetic field of the Earth has another. And of course the whole point of this setup is to get the voltage up before you even to wonder about the amperage being supplied to his appliances. And that's how the grounding rods are set up. They're set up in 2 sets to create a voltage difference between them, but I believe it's their magnetic properties which initiates the voltage difference between the 2 sets. So it's a cascade of responses, which makes the BNL device slightly complicated to analyze, not too complicated. But it's all based on basic principles. It's nothing, you don't have to invoke some mystery term, except to recognize that radiant energy, in my modification of Clarence's replication, that radiant energy flows in the opposite direction to electron flow. So far, that's all I've been able to determine. So I make use of 2 diodes per toroid. So since I have 2 toroids, I have 4 diodes. And that I know I have to use. At the moment, I'm using LEDs simply as a means of loosely measuring or loosely quantifying the flow of electricity through the circuit in 3 places: at the load and at each of the toroids, so that I can balance the load among those 3 loads, because each toroid is a load of sorts. Because originally all the flow went through the toroids and not through the load, and so the load light didn't light up. So I created a temporary short to light it up, and then I put LEDs in pairs, a pair of LEDs on each position of the 3 positions, because I wanted to be able to use either AC or DC to power this. And so each pair of LEDs are wired in opposite. One is turned around in reference to its partner, so that depending on which way the alternating current is flowing, one LED will light up versus the other. And if it's DC, just one will light up. And that way I can wire my DC either way I want to, and have lights light up and show various intensities to show that, first of all, it requires that I provide 3 volts to the system. My LEDs have a requirements actually of between 1.8 and 2.2 volts. But that means 1.5 is not enough, I found from experience, so I have to give it 3 volts basically, or something slightly less than 3 volts, which is what my circuit is doing, something over 2 volts. When I rounded off the double pack of AA batteries, 2 AA batteries hooked up in series, to provide, at the moment, something slightly less than 3 volts. So I'm waiting for the motors and the solar panel that I ordered. It's a tiny little, they're like hobby project for kids, for school kids. So I got DC motors. I got 4 of them ordered, that will operate at very low voltage, like between 1.5 and 3 volts, I think, and they're high torque motors, so they have a low. I learned that the DC motors that spin very fast tend to do so, and they lack torque, but I want torque because these, the motors, they're advertised that they can also be run as a generator, and I want that influence. I want that rotating magnetic components, electromagnetic field components, to feed back into the circuit, and and I also want brushed, so I got brush-oriented motors with commutators to create static, discharges, disruptive discharges, to act as a spark gap, but also a rotating magnetic field, kinetically originating from a kinetic source, a mechanical source, not a solid-state source. I wanted to put a non-solid-state component into my circuit, and I felt a DC motor with commutator was the way to go. So I got it with high torque in order to have a good I want a large back EMF, basically. It's the back EMF I'm looking for. I actually want that. Now, putting them in pairs, I'm going to put them in pairs facing each other, just like I'm doing with the diodes, which incidentally is the way Clarence set up his two toroids. Equally matched but turned around. How about that? So that's the trick for negating the lens effect and creating a very high resistance in your circuit too, for that matter. So you're not going to get a whole lot of amperage flow, which might be a good thing, because then it'll enhance the prana, the electron holes, the radiant component, to possibly create more electrons, because it's going to be more instances of electromagnets, in this case DC motors, and I'm going to put diodes on either side of them. See, I'm going to arrange it so that the diodes pointing inward have the toroid on one branch of a parallel branch, and on its partner branch in parallel to it, I'm going to have the two DC motors facing each other. And I'm going to have to put resistors on, I'm going to have to make up a new schematic. I need resistors on the other side. I'm guessing that there's going to be a lot of resistance that even one DC motor creates, let alone two facing each other. And so I'm going to need to split the counter resistance to counterpoise that, surrounding either side of the toroid, so that the toroid's resistance matches that of the paired DC motors that are facing each other in polarity. And I'm going to have the positive wire of the DC motor facing towards the positive wire of the other DC motor, so they'll have positives facing each other. It's kind of like, north poles of two magnet pairs facing each other. So it's similar to that principle that John Bedini made use of. What else? So when I sleep on my BNL circuit at night, in line to my earthing experience, I've got an open circuit connecting to the BNL circuit. One lead goes to earth ground, and the other goes to my earthing bed sheet. So I turn off the device because it creates noise, and that keeps me awake, and then I can't sleep. So, but the components are there for the dialogue between me and the earth to interact through the circuit that I'm developing. And that way I get a sense for what my next step should be, because my consciousness is, partly based on the electrodynamics of my physiology and the electrodynamics of the physiology of the planet that we live on. And the whole point of earthing is to connect to that physiology of the earth and not be disconnected from it during sleep at night. Well, particularly during sleep. And so this has a big impact on the subconscious, where the subconscious is much more vulnerable because the controlling factor of the conscious mind goes to sleep, and we can't be the major input to our subconscious mind anymore, or a input. Now we're no influence, and so now the environment takes dominant position in influencing our subconscious mind, and we wake up with that influence. And so I can deduce what the circuit is doing just by being the circuit. I become the circuit, see? And then how I develop the circuit is simply a response to how I feel, how I am, how I be. So it's a very interesting way to develop an electrical circuit, is to literally be the circuit. It's like a method actor, I want to get into my role. How do I get into my role? Well, you be it. You be the role. You be the character. Even during breaks when they're not filming, you're still in character because you're so in character. I think, several notable actors who are known, to be stars in the true sense of the word, some of them, that was their style. They never left character. When they were on the set, when they were off the set, they were, they went back to their normal lives. But when they were on the set, they became the character. Especially when they put on their makeup and costume, immediately they, snapped into character. Anyway, but some people, they live the character all the time, even in their off hours. I can't remember. Gary Busey, when he did Busey, when he did his role Down and Out in Beverly Hills with, oh God, who were the actor and actress pair? Bette Midler and, that guy who did E.T. Third Encounters of the E.T. Third Encounters. I forget the guy's name, but he did the husband. And Gary Busey never left character. He was always in character all the time for 2 months. He never washed. He was a bum. He was a homeless person. He never washed, and he stunk. I mean, he really got in character. Everybody couldn't stand him. But I'm doing it at night when I sleep, not all the time. But I carry the influence, the residual of that experience, the hysteresis in my physiology, the memory of that experience around with me in the daytime, and it helps me intuit, feel my way through the development of this circuitry to take the next move and not be too ashamed or too vulnerable to negativity. Also, it helped that I got off the BNL message thread in which I was being castigated for my involvement because I didn't play by their rules. I didn't follow their decorum. Oh boy, so what? So I made my entrance and I made my exit. And I only deleted the threads that I felt were way offbeat, in my opinion, But if they feel that all of them were offbeat, that's their opinion, I feel that everything that I left behind was, for the most part, accurate. There are a few mistakes, but I'm not going to fix them at this point. I'll just leave them be. But they're minor, and only one of them, or in a couple places. But I'm obviously I'm headed towards a certain goal, and I don't have any guarantee that it'll succeed, but so what, The fact is, it's like a sculptor sculpting a statue, and maybe you don't know what the end product is necessarily in all its detail. You find out as you go along, as you chip away at it, and that's literally what I'm doing. But finally, after 6 years of studying electrical theory with no background to speak of whatsoever in the subject, I'm finally able to do experiments. I mean, I did some before, a few years ago, that I have documented at both tinyurl.com/Becker-info, but also at earthinglife.info. And now I get to pick up where I left off, basically. Again, with bionics, seeing what influence I can have during sleep at night. So it helps to, hang out at energetic forum and pick up and get inspired to think new thoughts or to pick up new ideas. So now I know why, at least one set of whys, did Tesla choose the three metals that he chose to use, the copper, iron, and aluminum. And it helps. They do interact, and so I'm not sure how I'm going to use iron in conjunction with aluminum. That I don't know. But if it's any consolation, the EV Gray motor had an aluminum chassis, but the core to its electromagnets was iron. And of course the coil winding on those electromagnets was copper wire. So there may be a place for the three metals, in as much as a project case or chassis body could be composed of aluminum with a insulating coating the inside, dielectrical coating. In the case of the EV Gray motor, it had two layers. It had air flushed through with the help of a compressor to prevent arcing. And this guy who did his experiment with the aluminum pipe, he got it wide enough so that he wouldn't get any arcing. So he wasn't forcing any air through. He just had a very big chassis, basically, so that arcing would not occur. And then he had the copper insulated wire down the center to pick up. He thinks the aluminum pipe was serving as the ground, I think, because it was more massive surface area. And the wire was serving as the aerial portion. I could be wrong. It might be the other way around, but I don't think so, no. Because the consequence I came to, the conclusion I came to was that it was the mass of the aluminum that represented the mass of the Earth. So the pipe represented the grounded portion of his grounded aerial, and the insulated copper wire going down the center represented the aerial portion of that grounded aerial. So that's the relationship between copper and aluminum. But if you have it between copper and iron, it would be the same thing. The iron would represent the Earth, the grounded portion of the aerial. So in a sense, the grounding rods serve as a grounded aerial, and that's what Clarence alluded to, because on his BNL message thread, he mentioned Pierce arrow demonstration, Tesla's demonstration from 1931, and he assumed a square or rectangular aluminum plate bolted to the back side of the car, serving as an aerial. But in actuality, the aluminum will serve as the base, as the ground. See, I assumed the iron chassis of the car would be the ground to the grounded aerial, and the aluminum plate on the backside was the aerial portion of that grounded aerial. Because, I recognize that it has to be a grounded aerial, not just a floating aerial, because that's one of Tesla's patents that I adapted for use in my line of experiments that I documented at earthinglife.info, was that you swap out the capacitor that's in line between the Earth and the floating aerial, and you put a transformer in its place, or an electromagnet. And Eric Dollard said, well, that defeats the whole point of a transformer. Well, maybe so, but maybe not for an electromagnet. It might serve the purpose. I just used the wrong term. I didn't know I could have used the term electromagnet. It would have been more appropriate, because that's what I ended up using. In the beginning, I did a transformer situation, but I realized I didn't need to. It was actually, I was using an electromagnet in between Earth and a floating aerial, an Earth ground and a floating aerial. So that's what I've got in my study here, in my bedroom. I study in my bedroom, bionic earthing circuit, enhancement circuit, to modify my consciousness so I can come up with a better circuit. I think that's everything I can think of for notes. And I'll just post this for now, and I'm not going to make a long video like I did before. Because there I was constructing, the circuit. Now I can just talk about what changes I'm making, and then I have to keep making changes on my schematic. So I'm going to have to review this video to make my next schematic to make sure I contain all the elements. And I'll post the schematic with this video. Maybe I'll probably attach it at the end so that they be paired together.